This is Gemara Pesachim Daf Nun Ches as you begin the fifth parak, which we now know is called Pesach Sheni, the second half of the Masechta. Looking forward to also concluding the second half of this Masechta, everyone together, and let's hope that we'll be able to make a party, Mir Tashem, then, a Yom HaTovul Rabbanan, like we learned, celebrating the conclusion. But with that, let's begin this parak, the wonderful parak of Tamim Nishchat. But first of all, let's not forget our Chaylim, Mir Tashem, they shall love Rafur, Shlima Bekarev, Chayim Minchas Ben Malki, Demir Ben Kira, Menim Ben Vegel, Chayil Sipala Ben Asili Yehuva, Chayim Ben Some Sim Reyzel, Sarbas Canendo, the Besim with Chaysa, Yusil Ben Mindol, it has defended Shavalation, Vas Namu, Shafig, Khan, Rafal Devini, Teriv, Shol Ben Tihila, Daniel Ben Khan, Reyzel, Makal Chaya, Bas Mina, Liba Bracha, Bas Sevia Musa, Besoshar, Chayli Yisrael. Let's begin the fifth parak of Pesachim, the parak of Tamim Nishchat, and as the name itself suggests, this whole parak will be dealing primarily with the Karban Tamid. Tamid Nishchat, as the name suggests. Let's begin. Tamid Nishchat. When is the Karban Tamid? Obviously, we know there were two Karbanis. There was a Karban Tamid in the morning, Karban Tamid in the Bein Harabayim, in the afternoon. When was the Karban Tamid Shechtin? And the first Rashi now Muhammad points out about the Karban Tamid in the afternoon. Bishmaina umachsi 8.5 hours into the day. Vikarav, and it was sacrificed. B'tisha umachsa 9.5 hours. Ba'arvei Pesachim on Erev Pesach Nishcha b'Shiva umachsa. It was bumped up an hour early. Who shechted at the 7.5 hour. Why? Because the Karban Pesach had to be brought after the Karban Tamid, and therefore we wanted to have an extra hour, so we made the Tamid at 7.5 hours of the day, and the Pesach at 8.5 hours of the day. V'kara b'shmano mechsa, bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbos, both on Shabbos and during the week. Chal Erev Pesach liyas Erev Shabbos. If Erev Pesach is Erev Shabbos, Nishchat b'Sheshu mechsa, then it gets bumped even an hour earlier, 6.5 hours of the day. V'karav B'Sheva Umechsa, and you bring in the 7 hours, the Pesach afterwards, and the Pesach is going to be afterwards. What's the reason? The reason is because the Karban Pesach, you have to do Sli, you have to roast the Karban Pesach, and the Sli of the Karban Pesach is not Doicha Shabbos, important rule to remember for today's daf, and therefore, when we have Erev Pesach and Erev Shabbos coinciding, we have to move the Karban Tamid an hour earlier to 6.5, so we can do the Karban Pesach at 7.5, allowing for adequate time for the Sli. So let's just a quick review over here of the halachas that we just learned. The Karban Tamid in a normal weekday, 8.5 hours. On Erev Pesach, 7.5 hours. Erev Pesach Shechal Yos B'Shabbos, 6.5 hours. Today's daf, we're first going to have a makar, and then we're going to have a machlekes. Let's just see it. Then we're going to have a machlekes, how to learn, where we learn out the din of the Karban Tamid. It says, where do we know this? Amar Rabbi Shimon Levi Damar Kras says in the Torah, Im Esa Keves Echot Aseba Boikir Bes Keves Hashanit Aseh Bein Harabayim. The first Keves, the first Karban Tamid is in the morning, and the second one is Bein Harabayim. So what should the pasuk have said? The first Karban Tamid is Ba Boiker. What's the parallel of Boiker? Morning is Erev, evening. The pasuk does not say Erev, it says Bein Harabayim, between the evening. What exactly does that mean? Says the Gemara, Chalkua lebein Shnei Aravim. Split up the second half of the day. Of course, we divide the day into 12 equal parts. This is Shai Zman Yos, everything that we're discussing. So 12 equal parts. Let's say from 6 in the morning to 6 at night. Obviously, it's not accurate because it fluctuates within the day because we have 12 equal parts whenever it's sunrise, sunset. But basically, you take those latter 6 hours for simplistic purposes from 12 o'clock in the afternoon until 6 o'clock at night. Take those 6 hours, split it in half. The first 2.5 hours, Likan, in the first half, and 2.5 hours at the end. We know it takes an hour for the Karban Tamid, so you want it to be smack in the middle. So you have a 6 hour time block, so you can take 2 on either end, half and half, and the 2.5 hours obviously together is 5 hours, and the hour in the middle, that's going to be the Karban Tamid, and that's how we get that during the week. It's 8.5 hours. Again, 6 hours into the day, plus 2.5 hours is 8.5 hours into the day. Masiv Rava asks Rava, asks Rava, Erev Pesach, you shechtel in the 7.5 hours, whether it's weekday, whether it's Shabbos. This is again the Erev Pesach. You just told me that the Karban Tamid is a din daraisa. Learned that from a pasuk that's 8.5 hours. What's going on in the Mishnah? We said in the Mishnah that normally the Tamid is 8.5 hours, and Erev Pesach is 7.5 hours. How in the world can you change the time of the Karban Tamid? It's true that we spoke out that you need to have extra time for the Karban Pesach, and you need time for the Tzli and Erev Shabbos as well. But it's a pasuk in the Torah, you can't switch things. Ela marava nu makar mitzvah sayyid tamid mishayinatu slowly arif. Says Rav, the mitzvah of the Karban Tamid is once the shadow turns towards evening, meaning the latter 6 hours of the day after 12 p.m. My time, what's reason Damarkra Bain Harabayim between the evenings may idna from the time the Maschel Shim Shalom Arif, from as soon as the time starts fluctuating towards the evening, meaning when the shadow, we know middle of the day the shadow's direct underneath us, and as it starts going over, that's when the shadow moves. So that's when the Iker Din is, the Karban Tamid is the latter 6 hours of the day. Hilkach, Bishar Yimoisa Shana. Normally, so you have those 6 hours. But when are we going to do it? Really, we have to finish all the Karbanos before the Karban Tamid. So it's true, you can bring the Tamid from 12 o'clock in the afternoon, but we have a problem. We have to leave adequate time for the Nadarim and Adavais. Why? How do we know that all the Nadarim and Adavais, all the optional Karbanos that are brought, have to be before the Karban Tamid in the afternoon? The Rachman Amr says the Torah, Aleha. And we explained, on it, conclude all the karbanos, meaning on the Karban Tamid, you have to finish all the karbanos. So therefore, we really could do it from 12 o'clock in the afternoon, but push it off 2 hours so that you have time for the Nadarim and Adavos. Therefore, we do it as 8.5 hours into the day. But that's a normal day. But the Pesach comes after the Karban Tamid. Move it back an hour, so it's only 7.5 hours in the day. When the two coincide, and that time, what do you also have? Sliyasai. You have to roast the Karban Pesach before nighttime. Because the roasting is not Teicha Shabbos. In the Sheishu Mechsa, you push it up to 6.5 hours into the day. And that's what we're concluding the Makar for the Karban Tamid. Again, so the first Makar was we thought we learned the Bein Arabayim. Then you take the Bein Arabayim, you take those latter 6 hours, you split it in the middle, and you take the middle hour, which is 8.5 hours into the day. Rav was bothered, if that's true, then how does it fluctuate on Erev Pesach, Erev Shabbos, etc.? Rather, explains Rav, Me'ikar Adin, you're allowed to bring the Karban Tamid when the entire latter 6.5 hours of the day. 6 hours of the day, But on a regular day, no Pesach, no Shabbos, no anything, we want to leave adequate time for the Nadarim and Adavos. So when do? We leave an extra 2 hours, you do it 8.5 hours in today. Erev Pesach, you need an extra hour for the Karban Pesach. 7.5 hours. Erev Shabbos, you also need time to roast the Karban Pesach. 6.5 hours. Tana Rabbanan. Now we begin a lengthy discussion figuring out how we learn out this thing of when the Karban Tamid is and the Karban Pesach is. We're going to have 3 different pshatim. We're going to have Rava. We're going to have Abaye. They're primarily arguing on Erev Pesach, which is Shabbos, like this year. Again, when Erev Pesach is Shabbos itself, you know those confusing years, all the Bedlam, that's this year. That's what Rav and Abaye are going to discuss. Then we're going to have Rabbi Ula, who is going to discuss, in general, what do we do on a Shabbos? The Karban Tamid on Shabbos. We're going to then have 2 questions on Abaye and Rava, and then we're going to come back to the Gezerah from the drasha that we just learned about the Karban Tamid. Let's see, says the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan. Kisiduroi Bekol, Kach Sidur B'Shabbos. Says the Braisa, the order during the week is the same order on Shabbos. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. What does that mean? We know what that means. That means that just like on a regular, that's the Braisa. Again, one more time. I shouldn't explain because that's the 3 machlekes. One more time. Kisidura b'chol kach sidura b'Shabbos. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Kiva Emer kisiduroi b'erev Pesach. Cryptic words, we don't know what it means. Again, Rabbi Yishmael says whatever the order during the week is the order on Shabbos. We're referring to the Karban Pesach. And says Rabbi Kiva, no, like the order of Erev Pesach is the Karban Tamid. So we're trying to figure out when the Karban Tamid is brought. A little bit cryptic, machlekes, Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Kiva. I'm sorry, I was a little bit jumped the gun on the machlekes. This is now going to be a 3 machlekes, how to learn up Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Kiva. One more time. My Kamer says the Gemara. Amar Abaye Pshat number 1. Hachi Kamer, Kisiduroi Bechol Be'erev Pesach. Says Rabbi Yishmael, the first shita, just like during the normal time in Erev Pesach, kach sidurei b'Shabbos be'erev Pesach. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Says Rabbi Yishmael, just like in a regular Erev Pesach, when do we bring the Karban Tamid? 7.5 hours. So too, when Erev Pesach is on Shabbos, we bring it at 7.5 hours. Rabbi Kiva, Aimer, he disagrees. Says Rabbi Kiva, kisidura Erev Pesach shechal yot be'erev Shabbos, just like an Erev Pesach which falls on Erev Shabbos, which is what? 6.5 hours. Kach sidurei b'Shabbos. Shabbos, so too it's going to be on a regular Erev Pesach on Shabbos is going to be 6.5 hours. Again, Rabbi Shmuel is saying 7.5 hours is going to be Erev Pesach when it's Shabbos. This year, we'll keep on calling it this year, which is when Shabbos is Erev Pesach itself, 7.5 hours. Rabbi Kiva says 6.5 hours. Umasnis the Ketani bein b'chol bein b'Shabbos, and the Mishnah that said the same din is on Chol and Shabbos. Rabbi Shmuel, that is Rabbi Yishmael. Very good. Shot number 1. Says the Gemara, but Maika Miflki. With what are they arguing? And more than just a regular Maika Miflki, which sometimes just means what's the basis of the machlekes. Over here, Rashi speaks out a bit more of a kasha, is that really we have a difficulty over here with Rabbi Yishmael. Why does Rabbi Yishmael say that it's 7.5 hours on when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos? He really should bump it up to 6.5 hours because there's no Nedarim and Nedavos. We already learned that the whole reason to make it later is because of Nedarim. But if it's on Shabbos where there are no carbon Nedarim and Nedavos, you can't bring those on Shabbos. You only bring the obligatory carbonas. You don't bring the optional ones. So the problem is, according to Rabbi Yishmael, we just said when Erev Pesach is on Shabbos, it's 7.5 hours. The Gemara is bothered. Why? It really should be an hour earlier because there's no Nedarim and Nedavos. So what exactly is the impetus behind Rabbi Shmuel's din? B'maika miflegi, says the Gemara. B'musafin koidim levazichan miflegi. The machlokes is what comes first, the carbon musaf or the bazichan, which are the frankincense which were on the lechem upon him, those 2 spoonfuls that they had to be makriv those as well. What comes first? One very important point before we see the Gemara is that Rashi over here, Rashi 4 lines into the white lines points out, says Rashi 5 lines in, Zman musafin archayu b'sheish. The time for a regular musaf is 6 hours into the day. That it says yaim, that's important to know because that the Gemara takes for granted. Now let's see the Gemara. Again, we're trying to figure out what is first, the musaf or these frankincense, the bazichin. Rabbi Shmuel Savar says Rabbi Shmuel musafin kaimin. The carbon musaf comes first, the bazichin. Therefore, what? Avilu the musafin b'sheish. The carbon musaf is at 6 hours. Ubazichin b'shava, and the bazichin is at the 7th hour. Vavilu l'tamid b'shava is after that, and that's how Rabbi Yishmael says 7.5 hours. Again, what was bothering the Gemara was, why does Rabbi Yishmael have 7.5 hours? Why doesn't Rabbi Yishmael do it earlier? Because there's no Nedarim on Shabbos. Says the Gemara, you know why? Because you have to do the Tamid, you have to do the Bazichin, and then you can bring the carbon Tamid. You have to do the Musaf, you have to do the Bazichin, 6 hours, 7 hours, and then the Tamid is after that. Rabbi Kiva Savar, what does Rabbi Kiva hold? Bazichin come in the Musafim. No, these 2 spoonfuls of the frankincense come first. Therefore, Bazichin b'chamesh, an hour earlier. Because remember, the musaf is always at 6. Musafim b'sheish, v'avalutam b'sheish umech, so that's where we get 6.5 hours. So machlekes number 1, Abaye, the way he learns of Yishmael and Rabbi Kiva, they're arguing on is the musaf first or not, and then with the offshoot off of that is Rabbi Kiva says 6.5 hours on Erev Pesach when it's Shabbos, and Rabbi Yishmael says 7.5 hours. Maskvla Rava asks Rava, Midi Rabbi Kiva kisidura b'Erev Pesach shchali is Erev Shabbos kadani. What were the words of the Brisa? Let's look back. What did Rabbi Kiva say back over here about 6 lines into the narrow lines? What did Rabbi Kiva say? Rabbi Kiva Omer kisidura be'Erev Pesach. That's it, just on Erev Pesach. He didn't mention a word about Erev Shabbos. And the way that we just learned the machlokes is that, according to Rabbi Kiva, it has to do with Erev Shabbos, because he's learning that just like a regular Erev Pesach is 7.5 hours, so on just like a regular Erev Pesach and Erev Shabbos is 6.5 hours, so too on Shabbos is 6.5 hours. But Rabbi Kiva didn't say anything about Erev Shabbos. Says the Gemara one more time. Masla Rabbi Midi Rabbi Kiva Kisidura Erev Pesach Shchali Erev Shabbos Ketani. Kisidura Erev Pesach Stama Ketani. He just said Erev Pesach. He didn't mention anything about Erev Shabbos. So where do you get 6.5 hours? According to Rabbi Kiva, Elo Marava, second Shan explained the machlekes, Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva. Elo Marava comes on Rabbi and he explains. This is machlekes Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva. Kisidura bechol de alma, a regular weekday. Tamid is when 8.5 hours. Kach sidura b'Shabbos. That is what it is on Erev Pesach on Shabbos. Erev Pesach Rabbi Shmuel. This year Erev Pesach Shabbos 8.5 hours. Rabbi Kiva Omer says Rabbi Kiva no. Kisidura b'Erev Pesach, just like an Erev Pesach, a regular Erev Pesach, which is when? 7.5 hours. Just like it's 7.5 hours, so to an Erev Pesach on Shabbos is 7.5 hours. Again, let's just remember there were a few granteds that we started with. The granted was that during the week the Talmud is 8.5 hours, on Erev Pesach it was 7.5 hours, and Erev Shabbos was 6.5 hours. Now we're trying to figure out, again, when the Erev Pesach is on Shabbos itself. That was not a given, that's what we're coming to figure out. So according to this pshat, Rabbi Shmuel is saying 8.5 hours, and Rabbi Kiva is saying 7.5 hours. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Kiva. That comes out to Rabbi Kiva. Says the Gemara, 2 lines from the bottom. But Michael Mifli, again, what is the impetus of this machlokes? B'michmar bisra kamifliki. The machlokes is how long we will let the meat stay out. Because let's remember, the Karban Pesach, did you do the tzli on Shabbos? Absolutely not. We saw that in the Mishnah. You just did the shchita. You didn't do the tzli. So what's going to happen over here? According to Rabbi Kiva, you're shachting the Karban Pesach at 7.5 hours on Shabbos, when Erev Pesach is Shabbos. And when are you doing the tzli? Only after Shabbos is over on Motzei Shabbos. But that, maybe should be worried that the meat's going to spoil. And that's why Rabbi Shmuel says, no, don't do it at 7.5, do it at 8.5 hours. Do it the latest moment possible, so that there's not so much time with the meat sitting before you do the tzli. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Shmuel, Savar Chashin al Michmar Bisra. We're afraid that the meat is going to spoil, and that's what we have to do at the latest 1.5 hours. Therefore, you're going to do it at the 7.5 hours. That is Rav's pshat. We flip over to Amid Beis. Says the Gemara, I don't understand. According to Akiva, if he's not worried about the meat spoiling, why is he doing it at 7.5 hours? Asked the Gemara. He should bump it up all the way to 6.5 hours. And again, there's no Nidarim and a Davais, so what's the big deal? You should do it as early as possible. Says the Gemara, you know why? Because now, in this shot, again, Rav Akiva before didn't hold this way, but in this answer is saying, you know what Rav Akiva must hold? He must hold that the Musaf comes first. So the Musaf is at hours, says the Gemara, Musaf comes Mezicha Navalu. So now the Gemara explains, Musaf and Mishish. Most of we know has to be at 6. So that's what we're going to get. 7.5. That is the second shot. That is Rava. Masla Rabbar Ula. Rabbar Ula is bothered. He asks on this shot. Midi Kisidroi Bechol. Kach Sidroi B'Shabbos B'Erev. Midi Kisidroi Bechol. Does it say anything in their machlekes that has anything to do with what's going on during the week? If you look back at the words of Rishon and Rav Kiva, they said nothing about the regular shechting of the Karban Pesach during the week. That shall lead Rabbi Shmuel to say 8.5 hours. Rather, says Rabbi Shmuel that Kach Sidroi B'Shabbos B'Erev Pesach. I'm sorry, one more time. Midei Kisidroi B'Chol. Did it say that? Kach Sidroi B'Shabbos B'Erev Pesach. Rabbi Shmuel Katani. That's what it said. It said Erev Pesach. It didn't say. It said on Shabbos. It didn't say during the week. Kach Sidroi B'Shabbos Stama Katani. It just said that's what's going on Shabbos. So says Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Ula, I'm sorry, this shot does not work either. Elam Rabbi Ula, a third shot. Whatever it was during the week, 8.5 hours. De Alma, a regular weekday, Tamid. Kach Sidroi B'Shabbos De Alma, Divrei Shmuel. So Rabbi Ula switches tracks. Rav and Abaye both were learning, or I should say Abaye and Rava were both learning that the nafkamina is Erev Pesach on Shabbos. When you do it that, like in this year, Rabbi Ula says no. What we're learning out from here is a Shabbos Dalma when the Tamid is brought on Shabbos Dalma, nothing to do with the Karban Pesach. Again, so Yishmael says just like the Tamid is brought during the week 8.5 hours, it's brought on Shabbos in 8.5 hours. Rav Akiva made no, Kisidura Erev Pesach the Alma, just like in Erev Pesach, when is the Tamid brought 7.5 hours? Kach Sidura B'Shabbos Dalma at 7.5 hours. Now comes out that everyone is in agreement with the statement of being B'chol B'Yom Shabbos, because no one is disagreeing about that point. Says the Gemara in this last thought, Rabbi Ula b'may kamiflagi, b'gzeras the davanu davas kamiflagi. Are we worried? Do we make gzera up to a case where they had a darim and a davais? Rabbi Shmuel Savar, guys, we on Shabbos atuchol, we make gzera, and therefore even on Shabbos we have to shecht it at 8.5 hours, because we're afraid if you do it any earlier during the week, you're going to do it earlier, and we don't want you to do it earlier during the week. Why not? Because we want to leave time for the darim and the davais. Rabbi Kiva Savar, like guys, we don't make such a gzera. Says the Gemara. 1 second, guys, we don't have the Bavav Machsa. According to Rabbi Kiva, there's no Gzeira, so where do you get 7.5 hours? He should bump it all the way up to 6.5 hours on Shabbos. Because Havar, again, Musav go to the Mezicha, Musav and Beshesh, most of it's going to be at 6, Mezicha Mezayin, and then Bavalu Tamid Be Zayin Umechsa. And those are the three pshatim and how to learn up this machlokes, Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Kiva. Now, two questions. Meisvei asked the Gemara, says in a brayso Dami Kol Hashana Kula Korav Gil Chasa, you bring it according to the halacha, Nishchat B'Shmoina Umechsa, you shecht it at 8.5 hours, Karb B'Tachs Umechsa. Ube'erev Pesach, Nishchat B'Zayin Umechsa, Karb B'Ches Umechsa. So far, so good. Chal Liyos B'Shabbos. Oh, now we're going to find out. This is where Abaye and Rava argued about, when it was on Shabbos. So Chal Liyos B'Shabbos, when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos, Kechal Liyos B'Sheni B'Shabbos is very small. This brayso says it's just like it falls out Erev Pesach during the week, which is 7.5 hours. Rav Akiva Omer Kisidura Erev Pesach, it's just like it falls out on Erev Pesach. Says the Gemara, Bisham la Abaye nicha. Abaye is givaldik, because Abaye is exactly how we learned that what according to Yishmael it's 7.5 hours, because when Erev Pesach is on Shabbos it's like a regular Erev Pesach, and Rabbi Kiva is learning no, that when Erev Pesach is on Shabbos it's like regular Erev Pesach of Erev Shabbos, therefore it's 6.5 hours. Hello. Sorry, we just lost the daf. One more time. Ella, says the Gemara, L'Rava kasha. According to Rava, how does he learn up this brayso? Rava learned it's a machlekes 8.5 hours or 7.5 hours. Amar l'cha Rava. Rava responds, it doesn't mean like it falls out on the second of the week, meaning on Monday. Elaima, you know what it means? Kisheni b'Shabbos de'alma, like a regular weekday. And that's where Rava says, according to Rabbi Yishmael, it comes out to be 8.5 hours. Meisvei asked the Gemara second kasha. If it falls on Shabbos like the rest of the year, kula divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Kiva Omer Kisidura be'Erev Pesach da'alma. It's like a regular Erev Pesach. So b'ishlam l'Rava nicha. Now it's the opposite. Now according to Rava it's good, because again Rava's old comparison was according to Rabbi Yishmael, a regular Erev Pesach on Shabbos is like a chol, so it's 8.5 hours. According to Rabbi Kiva, it's 7.5 hours. Ela Abaye kasha amlecha Abaye. Leitem kisidura kol hashana, elema kisidura kol hashana, kol hashanim kulon divrei Rabbi Yishmael. And Rabbi Kiva kisidura erev Pesach shchalis be'erev Shabbos. So Abaye comes along and he has to tweak the wording of the brayso to fit with the way that he's learning it. Let's finish off. Taner Rabbanon, one last brayso. Minayin shli davar kodim letamid. How do we know nothing comes before the tamid shel shachar? That's the first carbon of the day. Tamalaymar says in the Torah of Archa Aleha ha'oila, that on it is the oila. Matal muda amar Rava ha'oila. Oila rishayin. The word hey is ha'oila. The oila, the carbon tamid is the first oila. Minayin shli davar karav achar tamid shel bin arbaim. How do we know it's the last carbon? Tamalaymar Victor Alel chalvi shlamim. My Talmuda. How do we learn that from the Aramar? Alel shlamim v'lo yalchaver to shlamim. On it is a carbon shlamim, but not on anything else. Meaning that is the last carbon of the day. Meaning all the shlamim, all the nedarim and nedavis are prior. Maskla Rava ema shlamim udolay nikrav ha'oilis nikrav. How do you know? Maybe you'll have to bring other carbon oilis after the Tarmil bin Arbayim. Elamarava hashlamim. We learn out alel hashleim called karbanis kulam. On it, conclude all the karbanis. That is how we're learning that the carbon tamid is the first in the morning, carbon tamid is the last at night. We as well learned today a three-way machlokes in figuring out the machlokes of Yishmael and Rabbi Kiva. When the carbon tamid is brought, Abaye and Rava argued about a case when Erev Pesach was on Shabbos. Rabbi Ula argued about a case when a regular Shabbos dialma, and then today we started off all the way back on Amud Aleph, the dinim of the Tamid Nishchat, that we learned out three basic dinim to Chazer Oiver, that the Tamid on a weekday is brought at 8.5 hours of the day. On Erev Pesach is 7.5 hours of the day, to leave an extra hour to roast the carbon Pesach, leave an extra hour to roast carbon Pesach, and Erev Pesach Shchaliyus B'Shabbos. I'm sorry, leave an extra hour for the Pesach itself, and Erev Pesach and Erev Shabbos, that's at 6.5 hours to leave the extra hour to roast the Pesach. We'll pick up from Daf Nun test tomorrow.